One. Order. Order. Well, welcome everybody to the latest meeting of the Environmental Audit Committee, and this session is on the review that we're doing currently into the impact of the planning and house building reforms on the environment. I'm very pleased to welcome our three panellists, and I invite them, starting with Mr. Trew on my left, to just introduce themselves and their organisations.
Hi, my name is Charlie Trew. I am Head of Policy at Shelter, the housing and homelessness charity.
Hello, I'm Alistair, Smyth, Director of Policy and Research at the National Housing Federation. We are the trade body for housing associations across England. We have more than 500 members who between them provide 2.7 million homes to around 6 million people.
And I'm Ed Lockhart, Chief Executive of the Future Homes Hub. So the Future Homes Hub is an organisation that's been set up specifically to support the whole home building industry to meet the government's climate and environment targets. We are a membership body bringing together the whole home building community. So home builders, we have 80 home builder members, including the largest 20, but a cross-section of smaller home builders as well, housing associations, financial institutions, supply chain, and others. We have MHCLG, DEFRA, DESNES and Homes England on our board as observers, so we work very closely in partnership with the government. And we cover the sort of full range of sustainability policies, so climate, energy, nature, water particularly.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that. So I'll start with you, Mr. Trew, if I may. To what extent do you believe that the building of new homes at the sort of level that the government is indicating they considered necessary is key to solving the housing and homelessness crisis that faces us?
Well, we have to look at the situation that we're in currently to answer that. I mean, there are 1.3 million households on social housing wait lists. There are over 160,000 homeless children right now, growing up in terrible situations in temporary accommodation, damp and mould often on many walls, miles away from their school. Their lives are being disrupted very significantly. It is not an understatement to state that we're in a housing emergency right now. There is a very significant problem that we need to resolve. This is as a result of decades of failure to invest in genuinely affordable social homes with rents that are tied to local incomes. What the government is committed to is two particular things in terms of housing, so 1.5 million homes over the Parliament, so roughly about 300,000 homes a year, obviously, but also the biggest increase to social and affordable homes in a generation. The really critical thing that we need to do here is focus on what is the thing that is going to end homelessness, what is the thing that is going to help those children who are growing up in these terrible conditions with no hope at the moment of ever getting a social home unless we build enough. And that is social housing. For decades we have failed to invest. For decades we have focused entirely on essentially private supply. And I think we need to rebalance that situation and focus on that. So when we talk about the housing situation, it's not enough simply to have a 300,000 homes target. It must have also a target for social rented homes, and us and many others in the sector are calling for at least 90,000 social rented homes every year for at least 10 years. That would be enough to house most people on social housing wait lists and to end homelessness for good. This is the scale.
I'll stop you there for a moment, if I may. I mean, just to clarify for the benefit of the panel, anyone watching, this is obviously the Environmental Audit Committee. We're particularly conscious of the environmental consequences of the house building targets. We think it's always important we hear from people who've also got a lot to say in terms of why we need more housing supply, but we're probably not going to get into too much detail on the makeup of those homes, with the exception of its environmental consequences. But I think it's a very useful sort of setup from you, Mr. Trew. I'll turn to you, if I could, Mr. Smyth. From your perspective, do you see the building of new homes as integral to tackling that housing crisis?
We certainly do, and for our members who are housing associations, they are part of their core social purpose, part of the reason they exist, and for most of them, the reason they were set up was to help tackle housing crises within their local communities through the provision of low-cost rented accommodation. And I won't repeat the points that Charlie has already made about the symptoms of the housing crisis. I think we're all aware of them. We know the housing crisis has been decades in the making, and to that end, we greatly welcome this government's focus on building more new housing and also its ambition to publish a housing strategy over the summer. What I think is important from the Housing Association's perspective is, yes, they are committed to building new homes, but they are equally committed as part of their core social purpose to play their part in resolving the climate crisis, the climate emergency that we're currently living through. So something that's important to think about is when we think about the built environment that will exist in 2050, 80% of that built environment exists now. So the approach that we take in terms of decarbonising our existing homes is hugely important, and our members' housing associations are leading the way in that effort to decarbonise existing buildings. So the average EPC rating of a housing association home is 72. That's the highest of any housing tenure it exists. And that's because our members are focused on decarbonising and have actively been introducing measures to decarbonise homes over the last 10 to 12 years. So 500,000, 500,000 housing association homes have improved their energy performance over the last decade. And that's a great step. I should say that there's still a scale of a challenge to come. There are more than 700,000 housing association homes that need to get to EPCC by 2030. And I'm sure we'll come to later in the evidence session what more we think would be helpful from government to enable us to achieve that. But our members are ready to step up to the plate on that with the right support from government.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lockhart, from your perspective, to what extent do you see these house building targets, achievement of them, as integral to tackling the housing supply and homelessness crisis?
I think it absolutely is. I have nothing much to add to my two colleagues. I think our focus of the Future Homes Hub is really working out how we can conflict that 1.5 million acceleration of the delivery of homes, how we can deconflict that with achieving environmental outcomes. So how can we build sustainable outcomes?
You predicted nicely my next question. Yeah. So to what extent do you believe then that they can be achieved without damaging the environment and within the sort of the scope of what the government's already committed to on the environment?
So yes, absolutely it is possible to build homes at that scale without damaging the environment. So I'm particularly thinking about homes that are net zero in operation, so building homes that don't add to carbon when you're running them, in terms of reducing embodied carbon, so the carbon of sort of producing homes, in terms of building in a way that's more water efficient, but also that improves nature and improves places compared to pre-development. So it's absolutely possible, and it is possible also to build homes that are more affordable to run, which is really important in the context of rising living costs. But it's not possible to do all that overnight. And there's a lot of hard work that needs to happen for us to get there at scale. So if we're going to be building over 300,000 homes a year, there's a lot of work to make sure that we can achieve those outcomes at the same time. And fundamentally, home builders and everyone else building new homes need a clear long-term plan. And we need a well-designed policy framework. And for example, we need the time scales so that everyone can adapt, have the right designs. It's very difficult if there are changes made in the middle of projects, that kind of thing, but we need a timeline that enables supply chain to bring forward the products that we need for us to have the skills, to have the right infrastructure in place, and we need it to move at a pace where costs can be absorbed and it's affordable. So it's absolutely possible, but we need really to work on a clear plan. As the Future Homes Hub, we in 2023, we set out Future Homes One plan. So what's the plan we need? And then after the new government came in with the 1.5 target, one plan scaling up delivery. So how can we achieve all of those outcomes at scale? There's a lot of hard work into sort of thinking about how we do that, but we all need to work together to come up with a clear plan, because supply chain has to move in lockstep with the industry. We need timescales, we need certainty, we need consistency, we need local authorities on the same plan, and then it's very much achievable.
Thank you. And Mr. Smyth, in terms of the social rented sector, to what extent do you think you're capable of contributing the homes that we need at a price that are going to be affordable without damaging the environment and taking on board the kinds of initiatives that Mr Lockhart was referring to.
Absolutely. So a number of our members are also members of the Future Homes Hub, which is a really important area in which they can collaborate with others and learn from others and influence government. As well as their focus on decarbonising their existing homes, our members are also thinking carefully about, one, the overall carbon impact of their organisations, and they are establishing, many of them are in the process of establishing or have established their current carbon footprint and are setting, therefore, meaningful targets about how they're going to get to net zero by 2030. And that includes looking at the impact of construction and the homes that they build. So some examples of that, one of our members, Clarion, our largest member, will build no homes from this year that include fossil fuel heating systems, so they'll be fossil fuel free from this year onwards. Sanctuary, another one of the sector's largest landlords, has set itself a target to reduce emissions from the construction process by 1/3 by 2030. Almost all of our members are committed to reducing all of their homes to EPCC by 2030 as an aside. Another member, Places for People, has set itself a target of 20% of its new homes being built with modern methods of construction, which are much less carbon hungry. And another example, my final example, Plymouth Community Homes down in the southwest, has developed a 72 new home development with all homes built up to full passive house standards. When it was completed at the end of 2021, it was the largest fully passive house certified residential scheme in the country. So you
don't believe, in terms of where we are currently, that achieving environmental standards we need is sort of unaffordable? It can be achieved hand in hand with these kind of targets?
Well, yes, it can be. They can and must work together, because we are faced as a country with two crises which cannot afford to compete with one another. They can only they coexist, and they have to be looked at together in the round.
Well, on that, thank you. On that sort of sense of those priorities, Mr. Trew, the National Planning Policy Framework lists three objectives: the economic, the social, and the environmental. To what extent they're supposed to be treated as being of equal importance? To what extent do you believe that the planning policy framework, as it's envisaged, places the economic, the social, and the environmental as equal demands, or do you see one as being primary to the other in current policy?
Well, I think either way you have to, as Alistair was saying there, you essentially have to assume that those three are not in contradiction, they are fundamentally working together. Our current view of the NPPF as it currently stands is that it does get the balance right at the moment, but I think we need to think in different terms into how we're seeing. Like, there has been controversy around certain words like using considered when you're talking about environmental impacts, etc. But I think that's where the guidance comes into play in terms of we do need to make sure that we are getting that balance right between the three of them. Now, I don't see a contradiction between essentially environmental, economic and social, because you cannot. There's no point in economic growth if people are not sharing in it. There is no point in a social purpose if you are not building environmental standards, because people will end up living in homes that they cannot afford in the future if they're not built to the right standard. They will be built in homes that are on floodplains, etc. You have to be thinking about the environmental consequences, because that has dire social consequences for people. But thirdly, if you get this right, you can both grow industry and grow the environment at the same time, particularly if you're investing in supply chain, in essentially the new supply of homes at the right standards. You can start building the supply chains and demand for those technologies that help require an system.
Do you think the current planning framework that the government is putting out now, it has got that balance right or not?
I think it's difficult. The problem is only time will tell as to whether or not that has the effect that it is, and we're going to keep close monitoring on it. I would say that as it looks right now, it seems to have the right kind of a balance. But time will tell, and we're going to have to see, and we're going to have to look at it. One thing I'm concerned about is that if that certain kind of words like consider, etc., can cause problems between when you get to, say, for example, private developers and their Sector 106 contributions. Are they going to start saying it's not viable to build social homes and environmentally friendly homes? I think Where you need to be clear is say that there's a requirement to do both, and then you set that standards and you basically insist that they do deliver those, because only at that point will people stop trying to wriggle out of their commitments and trying to build both of them. So there needs to be a bit more strength within it, I think, but time will tell as to whether or not it's going to be the thing. Just one last thing, you don't want to keep tinkering with it though is the only problem, because certainty and clarity is quite critical in this situation, because if private developers believe that things are going to change in the next couple of years, they're not going to build up, they're not going to be doing the kinds of investment in their supply chains that they need to be doing. So there's that.
Thank you. Blake Stevenson.
Thank you. My first question is to all of you, but for ease, maybe we start with you, Mr. Lockhart. The Prime Minister has said that he'll put builders, not blockers, first, and that in his view, blockers include planning committees, local councillors and local residents groups. Now, I know my local councillors who sit on planning committees will be horrified to be considered a blocker, as will many of my residents who care about our environment. But do you agree with the Prime Minister, or do you see dangers in reducing the role of local voices, representatives and experts?
So I think it's really important that we come to a clearer consensus around both building more homes and building better homes, and I think that consensus is increasingly there. I think people understand the need to build more homes, and I think we all need to get on the same page on that. But I think, as well as building more homes, I mean, from a Future Homes Hub perspective, we are laser focused on making sure that those homes are better homes, that they perform better in environmental terms, that we're improving areas as we build, and that we're improving the environment. I think that's sort of how we need to sort of make sure that people are more accepting, and as well as recognising sort of in principle the need to build more homes, that actually they recognise that new homes bring benefits to areas as well.
I think we've already quite strongly set out the case for building, and so I won't repeat that, and except to say that we must build. We know at least 300,000 homes a year to solve the housing crisis. But in becoming a country that moves back to building that volume of housing again, as we have done historically, we do need to bring people with us on that journey so that it's not carried out in a way where there is significant opposition. So we know at the NHF from polling that we commissioned a couple of years ago and carried out by YouGov that there is actually widespread support for house building, and in particular affordable house building. So the polling we commissioned showed that 84% of people think social housing is a good thing. It also showed that 70% of people would support house building in the area they live, and that rises then to around 85% when those homes are affordable to local people. So already you can see there is significant public support for house building and affordable house building. So in that sense, it's important to ensure that those people can have their say and can have a view on the area that they live in. So the challenge we've got is at the moment, local plan coverage, as you'll know, is very low. Local plan adoption rates in recent years are also very low. And without up-to-date local plans in place, much of the building that happens is speculative development, so it doesn't happen in a planned way. It doesn't necessarily happen in a way where infrastructure is planned alongside it. It's more likely to generate local opposition. So it's right for the government to focus on getting full local plan coverage in place. It's also good to see a return to higher level strategic planning as well, so that homes can be planned in the right kind of sub-regional areas alongside economic growth, alongside transport, alongside rail growth, etc., so people can see the benefits that new housing brings in terms of services and amenities in their community. If you get all of that right, then I think that you can have you can greatly reduce any opposition that you have to house building.
I agree with quite a lot of what's been said. I think it's very important. I think there is a bit of a false narrative, a false dichotomy that's being put out between NIMBY and YIMBY. I understand why it exists. I think the challenge is that I think the language around blockers, builders, isn't particularly helpful towards either helping getting the right type of homes built and good mixed developments, etc., or towards bringing people along. And ultimately that creates a longer term backlash against building in that sense. So I think the real danger is that we know we have to build. It's not a question of whether we build, it's a question of what we build, where, and how. And that is something that I think you need to involve communities in the process of. I agree with making sure as well that you are involving the right people within the process. One of the challenges we have within planning committees, within the current way of doing things, is that the people who are affected most by the housing emergency are completely excluded from that process. They are not there able to give their voice. It's certain communities that manage to give their voice and say, no, we don't want those homes because they are, we don't want more very expensive homes that are near us that we are worried about our house prices. When right nearby, there are lots of people who are homeless that need a home. So we need to change that conversation, help grow the number of people that we're actually feeding into it at a different level, bring the people who are actually affected by the housing emergency into those rooms and see how we can get them involved in it. Again, I agree with the regional planning kind of area. It's a problem at the moment whereby if you have a housing problem, an emergency in Bristol, you can't currently plan alongside your local authority in Somerset who might be anti-building in that particular area. And that creates a major challenge because what you really need to be doing is looking at a more holistic perspective about what the need across the region is, what the need is across the country, and how can we build good quality places. But I think this is where it is. Again, the same point. If you are looking at building homes that people can see are for them, that they know it's for their kids, they know that it's genuinely affordable, it's something that they can build a community. If you are building places that are planned well, effectively designed for community, then there is no fight between the blockers and the builders. There are only people who are talking about what we build, where, not whether we build at all.
So moving on to regulations a bit, the Deputy PM has said that she wants to remove red tape, which is blocking house building. Can you highlight particular regulations that you think can be removed or reduced to open up house building without damaging the environment?
We're not the experts on environmental regulation. I'm a charity. We focus on housing, etc. So if I'm honest, we've done limited work on looking at the kind of regulatory environment in this space. What I can say is that there are parts of the planning system that could be streamlined. A lot of the stories that you see around some of these things, an example is, for example, the strategic environment assessments. You hear anecdotal evidence of, things taking, 50,000 pages, etc., several years to go and write some of these. Now, they have a very important social context, social value, but sometimes the kind of guidance around that is what drives people to have to spend years, and that can cause delays, etc. So I'm not an expert on this. I'm not going to pretend to be. But what I will say is that there are things around there where it's not so much the regulation that's getting in the way, it's the implementation of the regulation and the guidance that sits around it. I think that's probably all I'll say in that space because, as I said, it's not exactly...
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
I probably find myself in a similar position to my colleague from Shelter in terms of the specific point on regulation. Our sector is regulated by the regulator of social housing in terms of the existing homes and services that we offer. We think that the regulator does a really important job in providing assurance to our sector's stakeholders, including lenders, that we're doing a good job as a sector, and even more importantly to the residents that live in our homes. So we think that that's a relationship that works. If I may stretch the point out more broadly, I think what we would say is, rather than necessarily focusing on regulation, what we do need, and the government has said that it will set this out, is a long-term housing strategy, which we hope is what is going to be published later this year. We've been pushing for that for a long time at the National Housing Federation. We think there's a strong case for a 30-year housing strategy to be published. Why 30 years? Well, because the National Infrastructure Commission produces 30-year assessments of the UK's infrastructure need. So if we do that for infrastructure more broadly, why don't we also do it for housing alongside infrastructure, so we have a long-term understanding of what we need and where and what it will cost. Alongside that, also, our members plan their activities, whether it's developing new homes or investing in their existing homes, over a 30-year horizon. They plan over a 30-year horizon, so it makes sense. And we also think that if the strategy is focused on outcomes as a starting point, then everything will fall into place underneath it. So those outcomes need to be things like improving affordability, reducing homelessness, reducing overcrowding, building higher quality homes, linking up homes with transport and with labour markets, and of course also producing homes which are zero carbon. So I think I would prefer to answer the question in that broader way, if I may.
Do you have any observations?
So yes, this is an area where we're deeply involved, which is really looking at how home builders achieve all of those outcomes together, and how all of the regulations fit together, and how regulation fits with planning, and that whole picture. And what I would say is I think we need to avoid falling into the trap of saying, let's ditch, this regulation or that regulation, because actually they're all serving a purpose. And, if you think about, take water, for example, if we sort of think, well, we need to get on with house building, let's forget about sort of water efficiency, then, if you look long term, we are going to end up with, I think it's 50 billion shortfall of water as a country. We're increasing demand as a country by 15% by 2050. And supply is going to go down by 15%. So we really need to think long term about how we can become more water efficient, so that we're creating the capacity for home building. So it's really then thinking about how regulations are introduced, how they fit together, how they're implemented. And I come from a sustainability policy background, and so sort of deeply involved in sort of developing legislation, that kind of thing. And now that I work in the home building sector, and talking to home builders every day, and getting them to walk me through sort of how they comply with regulations, I realise it's unbelievably difficult and complex actually as a home builder to comply with everything. And I have huge admiration actually that they can build homes, because it can be incredibly difficult, especially for the smaller builders. So I think actually, we with the government and others have got a lot of work to work out how we can make it better, so that we can really focus on the outcomes and achievement of a better environment. And I can give you, what I'll do probably is send through examples to the committee of sort of where it's particularly difficult, and how we can actually get a much better result for the environment. But I'll give you one example in a bit more detail, if that's okay, which is that over a period of time, local authorities have started to set energy efficiency standards at local authority level. And local authorities explained to me that the reason they've had to do that is because there's been a gap, between 2013 and 2021 in terms of national standards moving forward around energy efficiency. So then they feel, well, we've declared climate emergencies, we need to set our own local standards. They tell me they'd much prefer to have national standards and move to national standards. But from a home building perspective, it makes it really difficult if you're having to develop different designs in every local authority that you're working in. It makes it very difficult to develop supply chains at scale. It makes it very difficult to develop the skills, and ultimately it will make it very difficult to build in factories, which we're going to need to do if we're going to build 1.5 million homes. So moving to national standards and having a conversation, bringing people with us to move to national standards is very important if we're going to build at scale and achieve the sustainability outcomes we all want to see.
I think Mr. Lockhart has answered my third question, which was, which regulations would you improve or strengthen? So that's an example of something where you'd strengthen rather than remove regulation to sort of reduce the blockers. But I think, Chair, it would be helpful if Mr. Lockhart followed up in writing with some of these examples of regulations that you would look to remove, and maybe others that you would look to strengthen.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it's about how you can get better join-up across government between different teams within government departments and across, so that we're really thinking about how do we make it really easy for developers to achieve the outcomes on the ground. And I think that's where our focus needs to be.
Sarah Dyke.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned water quality and availability of water. In Somerset, we have a huge problem with phosphate and house building. There's about 18,000 homes that are caught up in a moratorium in the Ramsar catchment area. As the government is promising to reform nutrient neutrality and put nature at the kind of the heart of its building plans, we've got the Planning and Infrastructure Bill coming forward in March. We desperately need more affordable homes and more social housing in Somerset. Do you think that the plans that the government have got putting in place go far enough to protect nature and also deliver the homes that we desperately need?
I think, the big move forward that I've seen is around this proposals for a nature restoration fund, and it seems to be very well conceived, both in the fact that it's looking at nature at a strategic scale. So it's saying let's assess what nature is needed right across a bigger area and what nutrient reduction is needed across a bigger area, and that's much better for nature because we're sort of understanding what does nature need in total. Someone called John Lawton did a review of nature, and there's something called the Lawton Principles, which says that nature operates at a much bigger strategic scale, and that we need to sort of understand that and invest at that scale. So I think it's good for nature. I think it's good for development because it means there's a way forward. So whereas you've had lots of developers who have been blocked, particularly smaller developers might have one or two sites, can't move forward because they get stuck in nutrient neutrality for a couple of years. So I think it provides a way forward from a development perspective, and immediately unblocks those homes that couldn't go ahead. But I think the devil is in the detailed design. I think we absolutely need to get the design of that scheme right. One of the things I think is working out how the private sector can bring forward projects as well. And so, can we have a market mechanism, so that different providers can bring forward nature restoration projects. So that's one area. But there are risks. So I think it needs careful design, but it must be a good idea.
Thank you. Did anybody else want to come in on that? Although I'm conscious that the Chair might want to move on.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Pippa Healings.
Yes, thank you. And I think what we heard was unanimously, all of you have said that we've got to tackle both the housing crisis and the twin crises of nature and climate. And given that the UK is the most nature-depleted country, in the world, and in my constituency of South Cambridgeshire, it's one of the most nature-depleted areas within the most nature-depleted country in the world. So this is very key, that the planning system shouldn't just be about how to minimise harm. It should be what's within the NPPF, originally in the Environment Act, which is about enhancing nature recovery. And to that end, I'd like to come back to a few things that you've mentioned here, which is how strong does the NPPF reform ensure that this happens? And you've mentioned that some of the language around consider rather than oblige or require brings us to a situation which could be dependent upon local authority jurisdiction. So in South Cambridgeshire, which is my area, in the Greater Cambridge Local Plan, they have a biodiversity supplementary planning document because there's political will to try and say this is what we need to try and enhance biodiversity. However, that is still voluntary. So the mandate is still voluntary for developers. So what I'd like to ask is, things like we've heard about the strategic level, a Lawton principle level, but when we get down to those levels that are critical for the connectivity of nature within smaller developments as well as bigger, what do you think about? We have the swift bricks, the bat boxes, the hedgehog holes. These at the moment are not common practice across the country, and they are voluntary. So do you think that this is sufficient, and when we get to viability assessments, they'll actually happen, or do you think they should be mandated?
I'm happy to come on. So I was suggesting I came in particularly because we have launched an initiative called Homes for Nature, which developers can sign up to, which commits them to installing swift bricks on every unit and hedgehog highways on every site. And so we have 26 of the, all of the largest, and then a cross-section of smaller developers have signed up to this so far. We launched it in September 2020.
Can I come in, Ed? Yeah. So also, Natural Cambridgeshire and the Greater Cambridge Planning Authority has got, together with developers, a Building with Nature toolkit.
Yes,
their toolkits, their initiatives. What I'm asking is, should we stick with voluntary, or should this be mandated?
So I mean, my own view is that we should start with an industry-led scheme. So people are committed to it. We are tracking it. We're monitoring it. We're understanding whether it works in terms of improving species. I think it would be difficult to mandate it straight away in terms of, would you put it in planning or the building?
Can I come back to one of your responses earlier, which was if we've got to get this clear at the beginning, because we can't keep tweaking the system as we go along. How long have we needed to declare a nature crisis that says actually we need to be doing this now? How long do we know with the local nature recovery strategies that are in place across the country that actually this does work for species, having the smaller connectivity as well? So just again, I'd like to say, why do you think there isn't enough evidence at the moment that these initiatives, toolboxes, toolkits have been in place for quite a few years?
Judge us in what we've achieved in a year's time. So we've been able to move much quicker than legislation. So companies are committed for planning applications after September. If we'd gone the legislative route, it would have taken 2 years. So from, we're a new organisation, we've set this up. Judge us, we're very happy to meet and present you the sort of results in 9 months' time.
I don't know if I'd like to come back to the National Housing Federation, if that, so with you as well, Mr. Smyth, because what we do know is in planning committees around the country, when it comes to the viability assessment, even if these initiatives have been successful in some areas, finally, when it comes down to it, it's not obligatory. Actually, this is what falls away.
So I think, coming back to your original question of kind of has the government gone far enough, I think it's made some positive steps so far with the revised NPPF, which has been roundly welcomed and certainly will play a significant role in enabling us to get to 300,000 homes a year. In terms of your point about biodiversity, I mean, similarly, we have many examples of members who do build or redevelop schemes so that they introduce green infrastructure within those schemes. But yes, it's not nationally mandated at the moment. So what would help in terms of going further, and you mentioned the upcoming bill, is if there were a national strategic framework which clearly mandated how housing growth can work alongside protecting the environment and nature, and then that mandate could be passed down to spatial frameworks introduced at sort of sub-regional level, mayoral combined authorities, whatever they may be, and then indeed into local plans, ensuring local people can make decisions in their local areas about what works best for them, but knowing that there is a national mandate to ensure that housing development is sympathetic and works alongside protecting the environment and nature, that I think would be a positive step and enable those twin objectives to be pursued. So we're only part way there. I think there's more to come yet.
That would give us the both and. We can do both the house building and the nature recovery alongside that. If it's elevated to that level, that we need to do a bit more to do that. And can I just ask one further one, which would be about the same thing around our, still building, however many years after the zero carbon home policy was first posited, I think 2012?
6, I think.
So we're still waiting for the Future Homes Standard. So we're still building homes which are connected gas. They're poorly insulated. They haven't got solar panels. We've got a private members built, on Friday, which is about finally trying to get solar panels on every roof. What can be done, again, it's similarly around this, so that we actually are building homes for the future, and they're not silent mortgages on homeowners having bought at a certain price, then having to retrofit in the future.
Well, I mean, on that point, our members are certainly keen that the Future Home Standard is introduced as soon as it can be, and I understand that it will be brought forward later this year. So that's positive. With that in place, it gives a common baseline for development. Some of our members purchase new homes via Section 106 planning obligations, and although the reduction in demand for those homes recently is largely driven by the lack of financial capacity in our members, the other thing that they often cite is that they are potentially being handed over homes that come with gas boilers. Mm-hmm. And because of their commitment as organisations to EPCC by 2030 and then net zero, they are reluctant to purchase those homes for obvious reasons, because they will then be faced with a cost in short order of having to replace that gas boiler. So a common standard in place as soon as possible, mandating fossil-free heating systems, among other things like solar panels, would certainly be helpful, yeah.
There's little to add to what you've just said, but essentially the really key problem is we cannot be building homes that are not fit for the future right now. It's a ridiculous situation. That is because there hasn't been the clarity on the regulation. And it does need to be clear at that national level. We need to have the standards that are very, very clear. Sorry, not necessarily the regulation on the standards, because the big problem we've got, as you say, you know, the 106 situation. You're getting it's silly that councils and housing associations aren't able to take some of that stock because it's not in the right situation. It's not in the right kind of level, and they're going to have to invest a lot of money to do it. It's silly that we are building just any type of home that is not fit for the future. We do also need to think about, like, how do we create access to green space for people within those communities, and there are ways of doing that. And I think there are some really, really good examples of where this has been built and where there is good building going on. But you're never going to get that clarity, you're never going to get that in across the whole piece unless those standards are kind of brought forward. I mean, I don't think anyone's going to be in disagreement on that, though.
Yeah, and perhaps I could underline the certainty point. I think it's, from an industry perspective, it's really important to have that certainty. And I think, you know, the zero carbon homes policy that you're referring to, I think introduced in 2006 and was subsequently abolished, I think, you know, reduced a lot of confidence, particularly in supply chain. I mean, the number of different technologies that we require to build zero homes, and the supply chain is sort of very cautious now about investing, you know, in heat pumps, in all sorts of solar panels, all sorts of different, because they don't know for sure that, you know, the government's going to introduce it. But I mean, we are now in a position where, you know, we are sure the government's going to introduce it, and so, you know, there will be, I suspect, a timeline. Actually, if you look at a blog we've just put out, sort of says, you know, what we think the timetable is likely to be, but we think a timetable is likely to be announced fairly shortly, and that we can expect the standard out in the summer. We also had the 2021 building regulations massively improved fabric, so we're already building with much better fabric, but the 2025 standard will mean coming off gas onto electric, heat pumps, PV, and so as the grid decarbonises, we will be building homes that operate on a zero carbon basis. So it's a good news story. It's been a long time in the coming.
Alistair.
Thanks. It's good that we're moving in the right direction, but would you not agree that it's concerning that there is still quite a gap between what we anticipate the future home standard to be and a net zero carbon building standard ultimately? And would you not also agree that it's concerning that embodied carbon is not being included?
Thanks very much for raising embodied carbon. So I think in terms of the operational carbon, there's a good story which I've, you know, just sort of laid out in terms of moving off gas and but I think embodied carbon, you're absolutely right.
It's not taking us to zero, though, is it? What we're anticipating coming from the government.
So my understanding is it will be zero carbon in terms of the operation as the grid decarbonises. So, you know, if the grid decarbonises by 2030, we will be building homes that in terms of the way they run, are zero carbon. The big story, as you say, is around then embodied carbon, because as grid decarbonises and homes are zero carbon in operation, then all of the carbon's in the products, the materials, the transport, the construction. So as the Future Homes Hub, we're developing a sector-wide net zero transition plan, and that sort of shows the story in terms of how operational carbon now reduces very quickly with the Future Homes Standard, but then embodied carbon is where all of the carbon will be. And so there we need to look at, we need to work very closely with concrete, cement, bricks, asphalt, because it's all about the materials. And how we work with those sectors to reduce their carbon, but also look at the transport and construction activities on site. So how do we move off diesel on sites onto, you know, batteries and hydrogen and different technologies? So there's a lot of work, and we've set out in a transition plan which we'll publish next month how we tackle that embodied carbon and the mechanisms that are needed in place to reduce embodied carbon. The first challenge which we've been working on in embodied carbon is measurement. How do we consistently measure embodied carbon to properly understand on a consistent basis what our embodied carbon is? So we've been tackling that, but while setting out how we're actually going to reduce embodied carbon as a sector. Ultimately, it will need close working with government as well, because a lot of people argue for regulation underpinning embodied carbon reduction.
Thank you. Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Chair. And last November, we had witnesses who told us about the importance of infrastructure for making sure that right houses are built in the right place. Are there any specific approaches to providing infrastructure that can minimise the environmental consequences of house building? you like to go first?
Shall I start? So I think infrastructure is absolutely key, and I'm quite excited by the devolution white paper and its proposals, I think, for strategic authorities and starting to look at a more strategic scale in terms of joining things up in terms of spatial planning. And I think that, I'll just sort of briefly, it's important in terms of things like transport, energy infrastructure, water infrastructure. How do we sort of join all those things up so that we have homes that that are sort of connected, which is really important in environmental terms as well. But also then, how do we think of environment on that scale and start to link up green infrastructure? So I think there's a real opportunity with that sort of strategic level, at strategic authorities, to start joining that infrastructure up so that homes can perform better.
Do you think, just going off the back of that, do you think we should see nature and the environment as part of the infrastructure in a much more formal way?
I think that would be helpful from a home building perspective, because you start to join things up, and so you're not just looking at individual patches. It's a bit like the nature restoration point. You're starting to look at a more strategic scale, how you join up wildlife corridors and all of these things, so that houses sort of properly and homes fit in with the wider environmental context in which they're built.
And I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that. And
just a quick additional point on that, because we've already talked about the importance of green infrastructure and the role that planning plays there. So a separate point, which is linked, is the infrastructure that we will also need in place to accelerate the journey to net zero emissions from existing homes operationally is the expansion of heat networks. So at the moment, heat networks provide heat to around 3%. Of homes. That's going to expand to around 20% by 2050. And if heat networks are delivered with clean energy, then that's a quicker way to decarbonise those homes. So our members and housing associations between them own around 2/3 of heat networks. So we're really well placed to work with the government on that journey. So we're pleased the government is introducing heat network zoning to drive the scaling up of that process, requiring new developments and specific existing developments to be able to connect up to heat networks. So it's just to flag that as a requirement and also something in which our members are well placed to work alongside government to bring about.
And just to go back to you, Mr. Lockhart, just what specific role do you feel, if we did have a more formal way of talking about nature and environment as infrastructure, do you think new housing developments could have?
Well, I think it's. I think the proposal for the Nature Restoration Fund is that home builders could contribute. So I think there's obviously biodiversity net gain, and I don't think we've probably talked enough about biodiversity net gain yet, but. Which was mandated in February of last year and came in for smaller sites in April, and that means every new home improves biodiversity by 10%. So I think there's sort of that in terms of every new home is sort of contributing, and then I think in terms of things like nutrient neutrality, there's potential for developers to contribute to improvement of green infrastructure at a larger scale.
To you all, if this is okay, are there any lessons we can learn from anywhere else internationally on how we can do this more effectively to make sure that we're including this in our infrastructure planning and making it cost effective at the same time? And finally, as well, if there's anything you think we should be including in our recommendations around infrastructure and nature and environment. Mr. Trew.
I think you can see from examples in the UK that there is a chance to build properly designed net zero homes. For example, the Goldsmith Street development, famous social housing, 94 social homes entirely, 100% social homes. Norwich City Council, it was essentially, sorry, it's 93, I got that bit wrong, but essentially it's one of those key things that basically they built it to a certain standard with an excellent design, one sterling prize for design, but it's also helped those tenants to have much lower energy costs to the extent to which they are, they have for years afterwards been benefiting from even when everybody else's bills have been going up, theirs have been staying relatively stable. I mean, compared to everybody else's, that is, of course. I think one of the things that you learned from that is that you really looked at the whole picture piece. You looked at the social value. You looked at the design and the environment. They looked very much about trying to create a beautiful place. And they decided that what they were going to do is something that was different to how the kind of speculative development model works. It's a kind of structured approach. I'm also going to be intrigued in terms of the infrastructure approach about what the New Towns programme brings, because that has historically provided a great opportunity to think about this in a holistic way, to design a new town from scratch where you think about the connectivity, you think about the green spaces, you think about your energy, etc., and your transport, all in one piece. The key of that as well is the land value, because that's the thing that actually drives the competition between environment and social value, is the cost that you pay for land. If you can get that land at close to existing use value, which you should be able to do, you can design excellent places that are built for the future with genuinely green homes and net zero homes. The challenge, of course, of that will be supply chains, making sure there's enough skills, materials, but I'm sure we'll get onto that some further in with it. I think there are also some interesting things that you can do about existing homes. And I think we need to just see this as something where, like, investing in the existing stock isn't a terrible thing to do at all. It can be a good way in which you can also bring homes into value. So we're doing some work, for example, looking at how you get up to, say, 90,000 homes, but some of those are going to be bringing empty homes into use again. Some of those, including retrofitting them, making sure that you can bring them up, install your heat pumps, etc., so that tenants then also have lower bills. And I think if we can see that as an investment in the future, in terms of reducing emissions overall, it's obviously a bit less, much less harsh than building on new homes. But and there have been some interesting examples about that, which we can kind of send forward, etc. We're doing some other work on those approaches. But I do think there's great evidence internationally and locally about how you do this effectively. It's just a question of, like, how do we make that a national priority?
I'll be quick. I don't think I'm well placed to cite any international examples, I'm afraid. But in terms of your question about recommendations, I think I'd just reiterate the point I made earlier about the importance of a national strategic framework for planning. And if that is in place, then the mandate within that about how housing growth can work alongside protecting the environment will flow down to sub-regional spatial planning and local plans. So I think that is a really important thing to recommend.
Two points on the sort of technology point. So one, echoing my colleague's point, is that there are loads of good examples in the UK now. So now that people know the future home standards coming in, there are, right across the country, home builders are doing pilots and demonstrator projects, and we've put those on a map so that developers are now sharing information about what they're doing, the results and so forth. So I'll share that with the committee, but my perspective, it's really exciting to see sort of all the technologies and what people are piloting, and there's a massive opportunity to sort of share learning which home builders are now doing. I think the other point is that from my perspective, one of the most sort of effective ways of drawing on international experience is to send really clear regulatory signals about what about the raising standards over a period of time, because then that draws in a lot of the best research. If you've got global companies that are global supply chains, then they want to be in the UK to see how they can contribute to solutions in the UK. So I'll give you an example in terms of water efficiency. As you know, the metric there is about how can we reduce litres per person per day. At the moment we're about 125. We've set out a roadmap for raising water efficiency standards over a period of time. There are technologies like air boost showers that are massively more efficient but just as good for the customer, but they're not being produced at high levels at the moment. But if manufacturers knew that we're going to have standards, raising standards, then supply chains would scale up the supply needed and reduce the costs in the UK. So I think a lot of sort of technologies all around the world sort of come to us if they know that we've got a really clear regulatory framework. So
just switch back to infrastructure. Is there an example where, for example, they've that you can point to where they've actively delivered better outcomes for nature and environment and carbon when they've been planning like a neighbourhood level rather than individual property levels that you can point to?
Not off the cuff.
Okay.
Perhaps I'll come back to you.
All right, thank you.
Julia Buckley.
Thank you. You've referred throughout to the role of local authorities in this process, but we often hear about the challenges they have around capacity, particularly thinking about how they provide those adequate assessments around environmental implications, whether it's proposed developments, building applications, and so on. What's your view about those concerns regarding capacity? If I could start with yourself, please.
My understanding is that they're very real, and we hear that every day, just in terms of, I think, both morale in some ways, but also sort of the resources within local authorities. I think we, as we're thinking about how to improve environmental outcomes, I think we need to be really careful about sort of loading, requirements on local authorities and without solving those capacity problems. But I think there's solutions to that because, not everything needs to be regulated by local authorities. There are national regulators. There's different approaches to that. So I think we need to look quite carefully before imposing, new requirements on local authorities.
If I can just take you back to their existing requirements. So if you think their existing requirement is to sign off those planning applications under Section 106, but we're talking about a larger scope, aren't we? A larger scale coming through the same funnel. If they currently don't have enough capacity, do you see a problem there?
I absolutely do, and I think part of that is there's a danger of loading too much on the planning system. So, for example, we've talked about there's a strong case for regulation to be at national level rather than putting it through planning. We've got building regs, and so there's a lot that could be done through building regs that's currently going through the planning system. So I think
there's a local council officer that will go out with the building reg form and sign it off. Yeah. So it goes back to your local council who've had 40% cuts in the last 15 years. So you're still in a waiting list. So do you not see any consequences or implications if there is a deficiency at local council level?
So I think, it's not necessarily sort of my expertise day to day, but I think there is a problem, and I think the government's responding to sort of local authority capacity and funding. But I think as well as providing more funding, I think there is sort of looking at the system as well and sort of seeing what we load onto the planning system and other ways of achieving of achieving compliance and so forth.
If there are specific areas you think that could be regulated at national level, if you could add it to the note you're going to be sending them to Blake, that'd be really helpful.
Happily do that.
Do you have any comments, Alistair Smyth?
Only briefly, just to reflect that yes, our members who develop homes certainly report on an anecdotal level that local authorities are under extreme pressure, and lack of capacity within planning departments does impact on the speed of decision making. To that end, we are certainly welcome. We welcome this government's recognition of the challenges within the planning system. We welcome the allocation of 46 million for further investment within the planning system and the pledge to create 300 additional planning roles. These are things that will all help. On a broader level, though, the planning system is going to have to take on more on a day-to-day basis as we build more homes, but also as the ambition clearly is to move towards a plan-led system rather than a more development-led system that we have currently. We will need not only more planning, but also planners with the kinds of skills that perhaps used to exist more when we had strategic planning in place. So that will also need to be assessed. So the government will need to keep a close eye on the skills that are required now, but also in the future as we move back towards that plan-led system.
Would you suggest that should be a key recommendation to come out of today, that they look at increasing capacity around strategic planning and not just reactive officers?
Yes, I think I would agree with that, and I think that should work alongside what they set out in their housing strategy published later this year.
Thank you. And just from your perspective, we heard from Pippa Halings talking about how sometimes at the end of a big planning application, sometimes it's the affordability that gets squeezed out on viability. From my background as a local councillor, I know that sometimes resourcing is a factor in that decision, because after many years of negotiating with an applicant, towards the end, resources are so stretched. So my pushback to you is that the consequences of inadequate resourcing might not just affect the environmental aspect of a bid, but it might also affect the affordability aspect. I just sort of push that back to you.
No, absolutely, and we've seen that happen in many instances in recent years, and our members will almost always seek to maximise the percentage of affordable housing on any development, because that's part of their social purpose, part of the reason that they exist. So I would recognise that, but also the reason that is a challenge is because we don't have sufficient local plan coverage because we don't have a plan-led system in place at the moment. And so speculative development, of course, tends to drive these kinds of negotiations around the amount of affordable housing that can be brought forward. If that is clearly set out within a local plan and the expectation is clear from the outset, then land values will adjust accordingly and you're more likely to achieve that percentage of affordable housing set out in the plan. So that's why we need to move back towards a plan-led system.
Thank you. Did you have anything to add?
I fundamentally agree with what you said there. It's very critical. I mean, look, the planning, local authorities have been decimated quite significantly. They have many, many more demands than they had, and the problems and the complexity of the cases, for example, even just on the homelessness side that people are seeing, is very, very significant. We welcome the government investing the 300 planning officers. It could be good. It could significantly help. Whether it's enough, time will tell. I think the big challenge is that there is a big councils are also being asked to build again. We need to invest in their build functions. They need to learn. They need to grow and get building and get back into that business of it. So this is going to require significant investment from government in the resource of those local councils so that they can get back to building the services that they used to provide and they need to provide. I think though the point you made was about viability is very important. I think there is often a power imbalance between local authorities and private developers. And, as Alistair said there, I think one of the key things is setting out clear expectations, having a good local plan that determines exactly what social rent, exactly what social housing in general is needed, what your standards are, and then we can get up and start building it to those. And then the point is that power imbalance, it gives it much, much stronger capability for the local authority to push back on on private developers and insist on the requirements that are in there.
And finally, do you see any other risks or consequences if local authorities don't have adequate resourcing? Do you see any other problems or dangers there?
I mean, we won't get the affordable homes and social homes that we need. It's very clear. We won't get well-built, developed, because the challenge is if you just let private developers or speculators build exactly whatever they want, wherever they want, you're not going to get the social homes you need. You will not begin to address the housing emergency, and you will not begin to address the climate emergency. It's very critical that we do both.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. The final question of this panel with Chris Hinchliffe.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to push a bit further on a couple of points. Mr. Trew and Mr. Smyth, I think there's unanimous agreement about the urgent need to tackle homelessness and the affordability crisis for housing. And we've both heard from both of you about the urgent need to build. But given that the pressures that 1.5 million houses could potentially bring from that volume of development on loss of green space and fragmentation of habitats, and given the fact that ONS data shows that in 1971 there was roughly one dwelling per person, one dwelling for every 3 people in the country, and today we have one dwelling for every 2.25 people in the country, so we now have more homes per capita than we did 50 years ago. Could you comment perhaps in a little more detail around the particular role of supply as aside other issues when it comes to tackling affordability?
Do you mind if I start? I think this is the point that I was raising at the beginning. It does matter what you build as well as how much you build. Our key focus at Shelter is on social rent because that is the thing that is going to end homelessness. General market supply might have an impact on affordability. Whether 300,000 homes a year does that is up for debate at the moment. So it does matter what you build. So I'd be happy if we got to those levels of 90,000 social rented homes a year for 10 years. And did that properly. However, as I said, we've been doing some work at the moment looking at the makeup of that, and it doesn't all have to be new building. I do have to say, though, new build will be critical in it. You cannot get away from that fact, and there is no way in which we cannot build more homes. However, you can look at long-term empty homes. We've done a 10-city report that looks at some of the key cities in the country, looking at whether you can bring back some of those long-term empty homes that have been for over 2 years. Often they're derelict, and you can use certain legal powers to acquire those homes, retrofit them, build them up, get them in. So it's not just a question of new build in some cases. There is a way of doing it. Some of the work that we've done has actually shown that you can get to that 90,000 figure for no more expensive than you would do as if you were building entirely new standards, if you do some of that change of use, if you do some of that investment, and then obviously it has a lower carbon impact and a net zero impact.
Certainly, compared with our international comparators, European comparators like France, like Germany, Spain, Ireland, etc., the rate of house building in this country compared with those comparable countries is slow and has been over multiple decades. So part of the fundamental challenge certainly is supply. And I think the government has acknowledged that and has set ambitious supply targets in place, and that's the right thing to do, ensuring that a considerable portion are social and affordable homes as well. Yes, we can make progress in terms of empty homes. I think if we were to bring all of the empty homes back into use, that would only potentially be 2 years' worth of new housing supply. We'd also have to invest huge sums of money in homes which are EPC, E, F and worse in order to bring them up to an acceptable standard and make them decent. But that's not to say we shouldn't try. That should be a part of the puzzle. There's also another school of thought around redistribution of existing housing wealth. So certainly if we built more housing for older people, more specialist housing for older people, and there are reports which say we should be aiming to build 50,000 specialist homes for older people per year, we could free up family-sized housing in other parts of the chain, which would help certainly to improve the system. So that's part of the jigsaw as well. But all of these things must be brought together in an overarching strategy for how you want to solve housing in this country. And that is what the government has set out to do. Supply is a big part of that. There are other levers that can be pulled alongside it, but supply remains the key one.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Lockhart, I wanted to turn back to the Nature Restoration Fund. How would you respond to the concern that this is allowing developers to give money now to cause pollution now to habitats that are already damaged and are at the risk of functional death in some cases, in the hope that this money will be used in the future to offset it, as opposed to the previous system of preventing that pollution from actually going ahead in the first case?
I think we need a twin track approach. I don't think, I think it would be wrong to say sort of you can pay into the fund and, forget the rest. I think it's really important that we focus on mitigation as well as there's the mitigation hierarchy, which looks at, how do we make sure that we're minimising the impact first and looking for opportunities to improve habitats on site, and then you get to offset. So I don't think there's a question that we're going to sort of change that. I think there's a big focus on sort of making sure that actually you're focusing on the development itself, improving nature on site as much as possible, and then moving off site. So I think that'd be my brief answer to that question.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for your evidence there. Very much appreciated. And bring the first panel to a close. The sitting is suspended. Order. Very much to our second panel of the afternoon here. If I could invite you, starting with yourself, Professor Raslan, to introduce yourself and your organisation, please.
Yes, thank you. My name is Rokia Raslan. I'm a Professor of Built Environment Decarbonisation at University College London Institute for Environmental Design Engineering.
Hi, I'm Erika Lewis. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the Connected Places Catapult, and our focus is on enabling innovation in transport, the built environment, cities and local growth.
Afternoon everyone, I'm Becky, Head of Land Use Planning at the Wildlife Trusts. We are a grassroots movement of 46 charities with over 900,000 members.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and thanks also for being in the audience to listen to the first panel. So obviously well informed of the evidence that we're hearing. Can I start with you, please, Ms. Lewis? How do you see the innovative approaches in planning and placemaking can contribute to creating well-connected communities whilst incorporating the natural environment?
I think they're key to doing that. So you talked a lot in the earlier panel about capacity, about planning, bringing different parts of planning together, different bits of infrastructure planning. And we very much believe that the answer to doing that in a way that is coordinated is through innovative ways of thinking about that. It's through digital planning, digital integrated planning, and then using data and the beginnings of AI in thinking about how you can kind of reduce the need for human being elements in that planning process. So we think it's really key as an underpinning enabler.
And what role does the natural environment play in delivering sustainable social benefits for communities?
So I think if we put all of those things together, then the natural environment is part of that. And I think you got a lot of that from the panel before. So I think it's very easy to start thinking about these things in separate ways. And what we need to do is think about them together. So I think, it's just a fundamental part, and trying to make sure that the outcomes that you are aiming towards are coordinated is really, really key. I was really taken actually in the previous panel by the talk of the need for a sort of national plan and the need for that kind of broader coordination. We would absolutely be behind that, and we're behind it for a number of reasons. One, because that then allows you to start using these innovative types of digital planning processes, because you actually have a broader plan on which you're trying to draw together. But perhaps more importantly for us, we are really keen on ensuring that SMEs who have innovative ways of delivering some of these solutions are part of delivering those solutions. And for us, in 1990, there were 15,000 SMEs that were working in the built environment, and now there are 2,500. So that's a really key issue. The panel before talked about building supply chain. We're very, very keen on that. And so you need that kind of grand plan. You need to understand the holistic outcomes that you want to achieve, and you need to kind of drive that together.
Ms. Pullinger, from your perspective, the Wildlife Trust perspective, what role do you see the natural environment playing in delivering social benefits for communities?
The evidence of the role of nature, the role of biodiversity in providing us with kind of nature-based solutions, I think is well rehearsed. I'm sure this committee and its members will know the wide variety of important benefits, from flood management to carbon sequestration and connecting the nature and climate crisis together, as well as health and well-being of communities. So just by kind of one example of that is the Born in Bradford programme, which is tracking around 30,000 people in Bradford to understand what the key determinants are of health and well-being. And air pollution and high-quality green space are two of the most important factors in their lives and their health and well-being. And we know that there's huge inequalities in access to nature, so that's something really important to also bring into this discussion in terms of how you ensure nature, green spaces can support community well-being.
Professor Raslan, I'll ask you the same question. I mean, what role do you see the natural environment playing in delivering sustainable social benefits for communities?
I think we've all already covered the physical and mental health well-being benefits that amenity and green spaces can bring to a community. I'll also add the fact that it can support livelihoods and local economies. I mean, we don't have to look far around the UK to see many communities where the economic prospects are all based around sort of areas of natural beauty. And I'll just add, from the point of view of the built environment, we always look at how the built environment impacts the natural environment. However, the natural environment can also serve to protect the built environment from landslides, from floods, and looking at the future from overheating risks and urban heat islands. So it brings a lot of benefits to communities that live within our built environment as well.
And expanding on that then, in terms of local infrastructure, including facilities, utilities, community services, what do you see as the local infrastructure that is essential to ensuring the long-term sustainability, given the sort of size of the house building increase the government's envisaging?
I think some of this was covered in the earlier panel where we spoke about transport.
It might have been wrong. We can't rule that out.
Well, of course, to deliver sustainable housing, you need to look at sustainable networks that heat these homes, that power these homes, that in the future we might need to cool these homes. So renewables and heat networks are a big part of the infrastructure considerations. We need to think about the transport that will get people to these homes, back and forth from their places of work. And also, I think they mentioned a lot about the blue and green infrastructure that is needed to protect these homes as well and to create more value around nature.
Thank you very much. Yourself, Ms. Lewis?
I was just going to actually add, I would agree, absolutely, economic infrastructure. So ensuring that there are actually places where people who live in... So I think for us, it's very much about building places rather than homes. So people need to obviously be able to get there and back and all the kinds of things that we've just been talking about, but also they need to be able to have good, sustainable jobs.
We've heard that in a previous panel before today, that the government's approach seems to be starting with homes first and then work the rest out after that, and actually this... advocacy for a more sort of place-based approach was made. In terms of where the government is currently in their planning policy framework as it currently stands, do you believe that they have that balance right in terms of an approach that's focused on place building first and then the homes within that, or do you sort of share that view that at the moment it's kind of a homes first and the place building is sort of somewhat secondary in the way it's currently envisaged?
I think the intention is there, and particularly when you look at the work that's being done around local growth planning, that it is a much more holistic way of thinking about local areas and places. Whether the kinds of levers that are needed to be in place to make that happen are really there yet, I think is something that we would need to look at over the coming few months, but definitely the aspiration is good.
And from your perspective, Ms. Pullinger, do you have concerns about where the current planning policy framework is in terms of infrastructure and in terms of the place building at all?
Yes, I think it's still very difficult, I think, for local planning authorities to say no to development when it is in the wrong place, where it doesn't meet the high standards that the previous panel said, well, we need to be building for a future world, we need climate resilience, we need nature kind of friendly homes to be built kind of right from the start, rather than thinking, oh, let's just get those homes built now and think about everything else that we need to do later. But I also do agree with the points made about green and blue infrastructure being fundamental to considering what infrastructure is, and how we connect communities to that is really important. So everyone should be within 15 minutes of a natural green space, but at the moment a third of people do not have that access.
Thank you very much. Alison Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Raslan, I'll ask you this question, but if anyone else wants to chip in after, please feel free. How could the national planning policy framework be strengthened to reduce the use of embodied carbon in housing developments?
I think there are many levers there. The current planning framework, I believe from what I've read, focuses on increasing the supply of land to enable the building of more housing. And there are things in there that might encourage better consideration of how these houses are built. However, it doesn't provide a lot of encouragement or support for retaining existing housing and for avoiding demolition when it is possible. So I think there could be better provisions for that. And from what I've read also, although many of the provisions suggest that whole life cycle carbon should be taken into place, it is suggested, it is implied, it is not clearly required or mandated. So I think there could be improvements on that side that can fundamentally improve how we look at embodied carbon and reducing it.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else want to comment?
The only thing that I'd say is we've been looking at different ways of thinking about digitising environmental impact assessments and thinking about how you can understand not only the intentions that you have in how you build and what you're looking for in terms of the carbon efficiency of a home, but actually then monitoring that once those are in place. So I think that's something that's really key.
Okay, that sort of in part answers the next follow-up question, but I'll go back to Professor Raslan on that. What scope do you think there is for the use of emerging and developing technologies to improve the planning and delivery of housing while ensuring that environmental protections are maintained and improved?
So I'll talk about two things. We've already mentioned sort of use of digital infrastructure and technologies to help that. We believe there is a massive opportunity in data-driven digital technologies that can support decision-making, making it simpler, more accessible, and easy to implement at various levels, including at sort of local planning authority level. At UCL, we've worked on trying to develop some of these technologies, and they've led to the development of one tool that can help designers look at the life cycle carbon of different designs at very early design stages. Another thing we've been doing is looking at the integration of tools that plugins to that help us assess LCA or life cycle assessments that are integrated with building information modelling, which is a big driver in the construction industry now. So there's a side on the digital side. But there's also scope to look at various modern methods of construction as well, and how they can support delivery of homes that have less embodied carbon.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And Becky, do you have any insights from spatial data and modelling work that you've done that you feel can guide local planning authorities in identifying optimal land for development, including grey belt and brownfield sites?
Kind of the first thing that springs to mind with this question is that currently, as part of Natural England's Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment Programme, they are funding wildlife trusts to undertake work to map local wildlife sites. So these are locally selected and identified sites for their value to wildlife and people. They're not there's no single one map of those at the moment, so it's working with local partnerships. Several local nature recovery strategies that are in development will be looking at using local wildlife site data. So that's more about identifying places that we should be protecting because they're important. They're often of a similar level for wildlife as sites of special scientific interest. So they're really important. So there's lots of work in terms of mapping. Some of those local partnerships are also kind of to connect this into the technology question, using artificial intelligence and drones as part of that initial baseline to understand what habitats are there, what's present. So work is evolving in that area. It's obviously a very live area that people are interested to find out what works, what can we identify using drones versus what do we need to go out on site to understand. We were also really keen to suggest a new term for the planning system, which is wild belt. So this would be a new designation to protect land that is in recovery for nature. So at the moment, our existing kind of network of protected sites are all focused about kind of designating and protecting land that is already delivering benefits and are already kind of meant to be in good condition for nature and for our wildlife. So Wild Belt would help us on that journey to meet wider nature targets, such as the international commitment to meet 30%, to protect 30% of land by 2030. So Wild Belt, working with communities to identify sites that they value and where action is being taken locally. So it could be kind of a real opportunity to both inspire local action, but also to protect land that's part of kind of the wider nature recovery space.
Thank you very much. Thank
you,
Chair.
Olivia Blake.
I just wanted to briefly follow up on the social and environmental objectives of the planning system, because we've touched on a couple with yourself, Ms Pullinger, and I just wondered if you felt that warm homes and the impact on social, financial and health outcomes should be more heavily weighed, as that's a spin-off benefit of being carbon neutral in the housing. So, or if anyone else on the panel wanted to comment on that.
I mean, from our perspective, quality of homes is so important. Kind of, I guess linking back to some of the earlier questions as well about kind of the emphasis on meeting a 1.5 million homes target when planning, the economic, social and environmental aspects of planning kind of require a whole different range of metrics to measure success. So that's where kind of my response on warm homes would come in.
I mean, from my point of view, the thing that I think is worth saying, perhaps also in response to the questions before, is that if you use digital in the whole life cycle, you can, you know, we're actually in a position now where you can digitally build first. So you don't have to make mistakes as you build. You can make mistakes in the digital environment first. And that, I think, is something that we're probably not doing enough. And then thinking about how you can think about managing that home. So it's really likely that all of the things that we're going to build moving forward, actually no matter what the regulations are, will be absolutely full of Internet of Things, you know, IoT devices that would allow you to manage those homes in a way that is really fundamentally different. And actually, if you think about how you're going to use that data, potentially allowing you to put in place digital twin style technology so that you can test things out and you can use all of that data to get the kind of best types of management that you might want for these new places that we're talking about building. So I think there's a massive opportunity there.
And just to add, we're already using data with AI and machine learning to determine optimal development configurations to compare them with what would happen if you retrofitted a building rather than demolished it. And it's giving us a lot of food for thought and an opportunity to weigh scenarios that might happen in the future as well.
Thank you very much. Anna Gelder.
Thank you. How can the planning system be used to balance the need for new housing developments with the opportunity to retrofit and repurpose existing buildings to meet housing demand while supporting environmental sustainability? And I'll come to you, Professor Raslan, first.
So it is important that in aiming to deliver the 1.5 million homes that we don't neglect, or there is a lack of consideration for the over 25 million homes that do exist. We've heard that amongst these homes are many vacant properties for a number of reasons. It is estimated that about 75 to 85% of these homes that will exist in 2050 have already been built. So this is a problem that will continue on to the future if we don't pay enough attention to that. Specifically, one area of research that I am currently undertaking is into a specific sector of existing homes called complex to decarbonise homes, and they make up to about 20% of all existing homes, so about 4 times more than 1.5 million target that we're trying to get to. And these homes are difficult to decarbonise because of various social factors, locational factors, and also physical factors to do with the building themselves. And a lot of the problems or barriers that keep them from being decarbonised easily, and I'll use that term broadly, are to do with some planning constraints. For example, and this is just one example of many, there are 11,000 conservation areas across the UK. Planning constraints impact what you can install in terms of energy efficiency and retrofitting within these homes. There has been some movement in regards to some technologies such as solar panels, but there is a lot to be done, I think. There is also, I have to say, there are things that have been done in terms of decision making to support retrofit at local planning area, but of course this causes variability. Councils such as Westminster and now Kensington and Chelsea do encourage retrofit of these homes by relaxing some considerations. However, this is not something that you see a lot around the UK. So whilst we build, we need to look at what planning considerations need to be revised to enable us to address problems within these 29 million homes.
Erika Lewis, please.
I think the only thing that I would want to add to that is quite often when we're thinking about retrofit, we're thinking we sort of purchase from a quite a static supply chain, sort of well-known solutions, and the kinds of things that we try to advocate in the Catapult is that there is a different type of way of procuring solutions, and that's a challenge-based way of procuring solutions. We're doing quite a lot of work with local authorities on how they can do that. I think this is very applicable in this kind of scenario. So what you're doing is it is a very different way of going through procurement. Ideally, it's well advertised and well planned. So what you're trying to do is, again, bring in this broader supply chain that is dwindling and get smaller enterprises who have different ideas about how to do this to be able to be part of that. And if you can actually pull this off, then the benefits, I think, are huge, not only because you get incredibly innovative solutions, but also because at the moment we know, when we've been looking at it, that if 5% of public sector contracts, this is more broadly, were actually done in this kind of challenge-based procurement way, that would actually bring about 19 billion into a space where that's innovative solutions. And obviously then that creates a situation where the UK potentially is leading the world in terms of how we are doing this kind of work.
Dad.
I think just 2 quick points. So kind of thinking about the value of retrofit. There is a lot of competition for land in this country. So the more we can do to reuse spaces that are otherwise out of use, it's a good thing. So kind of retrofitting is generally something we strongly support. But secondly, the role of planning is really important to make sure you deliver that high quality home for people to live in, that you're not just creating kind of small boxes that aren't warm, that don't stay mold free in winter, and so on. And that's one of our concerns with permitted development rights and the kind of recent kind of quite significant expansion of permitted development rights, so that whilst they might support the reuse of some buildings, they don't necessarily create homes that are fit for purpose for the people that live in them.
And could you expand a little more on the environmental benefits of retrofitting as opposed to new build in general?
From kind of a wildlife perspective, it's more about preventing increased pressure on wildlife-rich spaces, kind of see in highly urbanised areas where you need more homes. It can be a really valuable way to reduce that pressure.
Thank you very much. And do any of the other panellists have a comment on that point?
Yes. So from our perspective, the environmental benefits of retrofit centre around the ability to retain, extend the usefulness and lifespan of buildings that are already there. And of course, the impact of retrofit in terms of disruption on the local environment can happen. It is going to be a lot less than major construction on that site. And even if that site is restored, there'll be a temporal lag in terms of how the natural ecosystem within it functions. And I'd just like to add, from an embodied carbon perspective, retrofit tends to, in many cases, I won't generalise, but in many cases tends to be better than new build. Some research we undertook at UCL, led by my colleague Dr. Yair Schwartz, showed that we looked at various archetypes. We looked at what would happen if we demolished and replaced them with new builds versus retrofitting what was there. The life cycle carbon was about 20% better for the archetypes that we looked at. I can't generalise, but it gives an indication of what might be possible. That said, retrofit isn't always the best solution from an embodied carbon perspective.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned previously that relaxing planning considerations was very useful in certain areas, but that it wasn't a widespread, something that you'd seen widespread. Could you expand upon that a little further?
Yeah, so I've gave the example of 2 local councils here in London, where the local planning authority had a lot of guidance in terms of what could be implemented in homes that were in conservation areas, given that they had many within the remit of their councils. There was guidance there for prospective sort of developments in terms of retrofit, what could be achieved and what you could opt for. For example, I believe that now in Kensington and Chelsea they're allowing things like double glazing, slim profile double glazing, much more than before. But you know, these are local decisions made by well-informed planners who have been able to balance these considerations. Unfortunately, you know, we would like to see this be more widespread.
A recommendation for the committee to look at that further. And Ms. Lewis, do you have anything to add on that point?
No.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chris Hinchliffe.
Thank you, Chair. My constituency of North East Hertfordshire has experienced in recent years a lot of building that is palpably unsustainable. Given the changes within the MPPF towards a stronger tilted balance in favour of the presumption of favour of sustainable development, do you believe that these changes to the MPPF will lead to better or worse outcomes for the environment? Ms. Pullinger.
I think ultimately the tilted balance does, as I kind of said at the start, shift it kind of further away from that comprehensive look at a sustainable development and the environmental and social aspects that we've already covered. But there doesn't have to be conflict between delivering new homes and protecting and recovering nature and meeting the climate crisis. Kind of existing policies aren't strong enough. There's a planning appeal decision that was on the same day as the new NPPF, National Planning Policy Framework, was published, where a local wildlife site will be lost to a development up in Cheshire, showing that protections for important sites just aren't strong enough, even where a local council has said no because of that nature value of the site. There are other places probably within that community. It was a space that was kind of accessed by the local community who aren't rich and wealthy. They might be next to a green space, but they weren't that well off as a community, and now they're obviously devastated by this loss. And there are other examples of a peatland local wildlife site also under threat from a housing development. So kind of we expect this kind of trend to continue on into the future. We have been promised another update to the National Planning Policy Framework and a consultation. I think it's this spring is when we're expecting it. And we hope that this kind of coming review will be much more comprehensive and cover more than just housing and housing targets as part of that, to make sure that nature protection and its recovery is given more weight.
Thank you. And following on neatly from that, in a previous session of this inquiry, Dr. Hugh Ellis from the TCPA told us that the previous MPPF framework was not fit for purpose on nature and the environment, and urged us to encourage the government to go back to the beginning and give a proper definition of sustainable development. So would anyone on the panel like to comment on what you would recommend should be in that definition of sustainable development?
Well, I think the definition implies or mentions that the full range of potential climate impacts should be taken into account in preparing and assessing planning applications. And again, some things are implied. From my perspective, I'll talk about, again, the operational embodied carbon. That's implied, that's not specifically laid out.
Can I just interrupt briefly? Would you like to see it explicitly laid out rather than just implied?
If it is something that is sort of part of the overall strategy for ensuring that environmental impact is sort of managed well, you know, where we have thoughts on various metrics, carbon being one of them, then yes, it should be explicitly in there rather than implied, because that creates confusion. It shifts the burden of having to look for these things on local authorities who might or might not have the capacity to understand and kind of look at that information. So, yes.
The only thing that I'd add is we would very much advocate access to the national environmental data sets, so that then you can discover and analyse and assess. So rather than making a comment on what is sustainability, for us it's more about how do you allow the people who are trying to make those assessments to access the kinds of data sets that allow them to do that well.
So that presumably would be a recommendation you'd like to see this committee make.
Yeah. From my perspective, it's about having nature at the heart of the definition of what sustainable development is. Without healthy ecosystems, without high quality nature, that we don't have the positive social and economic outcomes that come from that.
Again, then, would you like to see that explicitly stated within the definition?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And then a final question from me then, relating to the stronger tilted balance in favour of the presumption of sustainable development. Does anyone on the panel have anything they would like to comment about whether there are any specific areas of England that could be particularly affected, either positively or negatively, by that change within the MPPF?
Not from my point of view.
There we go. That's nice and easy.
Okay. Thank you very much. Ellie Chowns.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, panel. So the government has indicated that they want to shift more towards a kind of I think what they call a strategic, more regional approach to nature protection rather than a site-specific basis. Can I ask you, perhaps Ms Pillinger, first on that, what do you think are the environmental impacts of a shift in that direction in policy?
There's a lot to get your head round in the government's proposal. We obviously only had the working paper that's quite short, quite brief, doesn't really cover everything in it before Christmas. So it is difficult to outline all of the implications that a shift could have. From Wildlife Trust's perspective, for some environmental impacts, it could be beneficial. It could mean that the money that is spent on mitigating environmental impacts of development can be spent strategically and kind of create those more bigger, better, joined up Lawton principles that kind of previous panellists mentioned. But without clear safeguards, preferably written in law in the upcoming Planning and Infrastructure Bill, without clear ambition for nature's recovery alongside house building targets, and without resourcing the system, so having the right data to actually inform the decisions, there is a risk that it would weaken the environmental protections that we've got currently in place for key species and key habitats.
Thank you. Would other panel members like to comment on that?
I'd like to add sort of area-based approaches may miss out on, say, issues that might impact, for example, new builds on small infill plots, for example. That might be within areas that are already built up, but have a very important role within that small-scale neighbourhood. So it's great to see the area-based approach open up opportunities for more joined-up thinking and more strategic thinking, but there will be cases where sort of a generalised approach or an area-based approach might miss small issues. Well, small in terms of size rather than impact.
The only other advantage I can see from the area-based way of dealing with things is including communities in that discussion. So it's much easier if you're thinking about local areas and local communities. And from our point of view, that's a really key way of helping think through holistic outcomes and also potentially thinking about different ways of dealing with solutions. It's very easy to imagine as authorities that you have the right answers and sometimes you don't.
Thank you, thank you. So I'm hearing a somewhat more nuanced and cautious view from this panel than from certainly some members of the previous panel who were fairly bullish about it. Kind of relatedly, so the government's proposed setting up this nature restoration fund. I mean, I suppose, how would you respond to the suggestion that that might be a little bit like sinners buying indulgences from the Catholic Church back in the day? What do you feel the likely impact of the Nature Restoration Fund-based approach to addressing potential environmental damage from development might be overall? Perhaps Ms. Pullinger first.
I can kick us off. I guess our concerns with the Nature Restoration Fund is that it doesn't address the fundamental root causes that we're kind of seeing in terms of the environmental impact assessment process and then the delivery of environmental mitigation. The Office for Environmental Protection published a report last year on the subject, which identified access to data, access to expertise, and then post-decision monitoring and evaluation as the three root causes of problems, I guess, in the current system. And so having a fund doesn't necessarily solve the problems of, well, how do you understand where to spend that money? And kind of all of those other questions. And obviously having the expertise and capacity to actually go and deliver those projects on the ground is also going to be a key factor. In terms of the fund in general, it might make some things easier. So it is something that we will be thinking through. We'll be having various discussions across the network of wildlife trusts on some of those details to see what safeguards would need to be in place in order for the Nature Restoration Fund to be a success. So very happy to share that with the committee as that thinking develops.
Thank you. I think we'd be very interested in any suggestions for recommendations to put those rails on, yeah.
I think from our perspective, if you look at sort of carbon offsetting as a precedent, a similar precedent, there are now debates as to the fact that carbon offsetting might be one of the biggest barriers to actually achieving proper carbon reduction targets within specific sectors. So is there anything to learn from that when we're looking at the Nature Restoration Fund? Another thing I'm aware of is the level of funding that will be required to actually make a change. I think there was an estimate that about £43 billion would actually be needed as a minimum to deliver the ambition for the government, and that is a lot. And there are issues where sort of it doesn't lend itself to private investment in a sense, sort of the biodiversity angle. So again, those are some, I think, concerns that should be taken into account when thinking strategically about the fund. But it does have some very worthy commitments and aspirations, I think.
Thank you. I think, just to pick up on that, I think you raise an interesting point about the analogy with carbon offsetting, but I think there is a crucial difference because whereas global warming is a global phenomenon, nature damage is very much a localised phenomenon. So offsetting is more complex in that context. Yeah. Ms Lewis, anything to add?
I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah.
Can I just come back in? Kind of, obviously, we've already got some strategic approaches to some environmental impacts. So district level licensing for great crested newts is one that often comes up. Kind of some monitoring does take place of kind of ponds that are created through that funding, and we know that they do attract the newts that they're designed for. But what we don't really have is a consistent kind of monitoring report of what is already happening that we can then learn from. So kind of learning from carbon offsetting is one thing, but kind of learning from the stuff that's already happening is also really important. So that is something we would like to see, is an understanding, is a report on what is already working, suitable alternative natural green space. So SANG's provision is another area where strategic approaches are already being delivered. Is it possible to learn more about what benefit they are having for the habitats they're designed to protect?
Very much. Martin Rhodes.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to focus in particular on threatened species. Start with you, Ms Bollinger, in terms of the Wildlife Trust view on this. In terms of the current planning system, does it, in your view, do enough to provide for protection for endangered and threatened species?
The short answer is no. There's always more that can be done. So kind of briefly touched on biodiversity net gain with the previous panel, and so that's useful to provide a consistent metric to look at habitats, but what it doesn't do is enable you to look at species and the value of habitats to the wildlife that uses them. There's various bits of research in how invertebrates, so insects, are particularly hard done by some of the scoring that's in the metrics. That's something that we'd be looking at in future iterations of the metric to address. The updated NPPF did include some kind of small references to swifts and hedgehogs in the kind of revised version, and we would like to see kind of stronger support to kind of mandate those kind of small scale nature actions that can be really beneficial for kind of species that have been in decline. We know that several species use swift boxes, for example, so if every home had a swift box, it's not just swifts that you might be helping, it might be house sparrows, house martins and so on as part of that work.
So in terms of any potential changes to planning, what would you like to see?
So Wildbelt is our kind of key ask for kind of the new designation. Kind of we've got the Environment Act sets targets to kind of halt the loss of biodiversity. In order to turn that around, we need more wildlife-rich habitats. So we need to protect those habitats that are in recovery to help us get there. Kind of one of the benefits that we have seen through making biodiversity net gain mandatory is kind of talking to ecologists that are working with developers. They are being asked about what they think of designs much earlier in the process than they had been before. So kind of anything that we can get through to make sure minimum standards are there as a requirement can be really important. On the flip side of that, where local authorities want to be more ambitious, that should be encouraged rather than kind of prevented through guidance that makes it just too difficult to kind of ask for more, which is something we are seeing with biodiversity net gain guidance, which kind of sets the bar really high for local authorities to justify asking for more than 10%. And given the 10% value that is in the Environment Act is enough to maintain the status quo based on the evidence that DEFRA itself kind of published, obviously we want to go more if biodiversity net gain is to genuinely deliver gains.
Thanks. So in terms of trying to think through what you say, in terms of, you mentioned wild belt, you mentioned having stronger minimum standards, but also that encouragement in the system to go further than minimum standards.
Yeah.
You also mentioned in your previous answer about metrics. Is there something about the metrics that we need to be looking at in terms of reforming?
So in terms of the I guess it's metrics of how you measure success of what the planning system is trying to achieve,
right,
and making sure that it's not just one metric of how many homes have you built in a year. There are kind of other things that you should be looking at as part of that. So how many homes are being built that meet high energy efficiency standards? How many have got a Smyth brick included? And so on. The other metrics, the biodiversity metric, is quite a specific metric, and that will be reviewed on a regular basis. So kind of making sure that uses the latest available evidence on how to score different habitats to make sure that they support biodiversity is really important.
Mm-hmm. And finally, in terms of overall, then, in terms of coming to the sort of central debate here, in terms of would these reforms and further protections for threatened species, would that slow down the ability to respond in terms of more houses, more homes for people?
It doesn't have to. Kind of one of the challenges, I guess, in terms of kind of work to encourage species is actually the post-development side. Right. A report commissioned by Wild Justice found that around half of the kind of nature-friendly design measures that had been secured as part of being granted planning permission weren't being delivered in new developments. So they went round various housing estates where you're kind of counting the number of trees that had been planted or the number of holes in fences and Smyth bricks they could see. And so actually it's not just about securing them as part of the planning process, it's also about ensuring that they are delivered afterwards.
So one further thing you would want is more sort of post the process of the planning, in terms of how do you actually then look at whether it actually has been put into practice?
Yes, indeed. Okay. And that's where local authority resourcing comes in. I know it was a topic that got covered before. But we know ecology and biodiversity is one of the biggest skills gaps in local authorities. So kind of bridging that gap is going to be important for that process.
Thank you. Do either of the panellists want to add anything on that?
I mean, the only thing I would add is when you get to that level of complexity, the push then to need a digital planning system is really quite key, because you're dealing with so many different metrics at the same time, and you've got the undercapacity in the local authority environment.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, we've heard from both the previous panel and I think yourselves that in broad terms the house building targets themselves could be achieved without a detriment to nature and the environment, but the question is, will they? On the basis of what you've seen in the new planning policy framework, how confident can you be that we are currently on target to be able to deliver these houses with the necessary protections for the environment, for nature? I'll start with you, Ms. Lewis.
Yeah. For me, it's not really about what we write in the framework. It's more about how we enact it that is really important. I think it's important that we're saying, yes, we're aiming for the right kinds of things, and that the balance is there, and that's what we've been talking about. But thinking about using all of the modern technology that's available to us to ensure that we are driving everything in the same direction, understanding all the different trade-offs that we're making, thinking about that circular use of digital data in terms of how you're thinking about the building, how you're doing the building, so thinking through how you're actually going to be doing the building, and then how you're going to manage the building afterwards, and the environment around it is key to making that happen.
So, I mean, to try and push you, do you have confidence on the basis of the approach that's currently being taken that this sort of level of house building increase can be done without detriment to nature and environment on the basis of the way it is currently being envisaged?
I still think we need innovative practices in place.
Okay, Professor Raslan.
I think it's not sort of a straightforward sort of solution to the problem. I think that even if we do build more, there have been questions raised as to the quality of what we build and the impact of that, not only immediately but also in the long term. Are we building homes that are resilient? How will they function or perform in the future? Will they then need to be replaced themselves in 15 years because we've built them with materials that aren't resilient, for example? So I think we theoretically could build the 1.5 million homes, but will they be resilient is another question, and I think there should be more protections to ensure that.
Okay, and finally, yourself, Ms. Bullinger.
I think the publication of the NPPF in December kind of felt like the first of several things that are to come out kind of following the general election last year. The previous panel mentioned the land use framework and kind of national level strategic spatial planning. Very much agree that that is key if we are to deliver homes and meet the nature and climate crisis together. The devils will always be in the detail, so obviously the Planning and Infrastructure Bill and getting the words right on the page of legislation is going to be really important to make sure that we don't go back on our kind of environmental protections. And the other, I guess, key point is about trust and making sure all different stakeholders trust the planning system. It's come under quite a lot of bashing from various quarters about its role in either allowing too much to development, not allowing enough development, depending on where you are or what kind of, which stakeholder you're talking to. And making sure the language is there that means that the planning system is a positive tool. And we're all agreed that the planning is a really important way to deliver on all of these outcomes together, and that we can deliver new homes and address the climate and nature crisis together is really important.
The Prime Minister was pretty clear in his appearance at the Liaison Committee that where he stands on that balance. He thinks the planning system is denying too many houses being built rather than the other way round. He referred to bats and newts getting in the way of planning applications. I mean, does this make you as the Wildlife Trust feel that the progress you've made historically in terms of nature protections are under threat?
It's very frustrating to hear newts, I think, once again coming kind of under fire. They're relevant in very few planning applications each year, so it is frustrating. I did see the phrase kind of scape newt being used on social media, which I did enjoy. It is frustrating. I think one thing that has changed a little is the amount of engagement between MHCLG and DEFRA, who are clearly working closely together on some of these reforms, and they are talking to stakeholders about them at a stage kind of before a fully realised proposal is made. And so that is a step in the right direction in terms of getting those details right.
Okay. Well, to Professor Raslan, Ms Lewis, Ms Pullinger, thank you so much for the evidence we've heard from you today, and bring this sitting to a close. Order.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.